related to what's going on with some key economic development projects, particularly the northeast corner.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, so in the northeast corner,
Trader Joe's.
very carefree. So just kind of give you yeah. So the update on that is we were looking to try to get to the DRB meeting and have their site plan approved this month. We had some issues. We're down to kind of one issue, and that issue is just related to some of the signage that they're working on. And so we pushed this off to the next meeting, but I think either way we're going to try to bring that forward for the site plan approval of the DRB next month. And I think it's highly likely that's going to be done. So.
Right, in June, and just to be clear, I mean, they didn't meet the deadline submittal, but like Steve said, because of an outstanding item, but they're working towards June, so it was at their decision.
Any progress on tenants?
So the tenant progress, from what I understand, they do have leases signed. They're currently working with some groups. Their ICSC meeting, the International Council of Shopping Centers, which is the big retail meeting that happens in Vegas every year, is the week of the 19th. And so they're going to be meeting with a lot more tenants there. So they're still really trying to iron out, particularly on the anchor side of things, anchor tenants, what those anchor tenants specifically are going to look like. But as far as the conversation we have with them, they're moving forward on the project. It's right now it's a little bit more fluid. The tariffs, just not the tariffs specifically necessarily, but just the chaos it kind of caused. I think it just puts a lot of pause into a lot of folks. They were getting, mixed information on what construction costs changes were going to be made related to lumber and steel. And then, you have retailers. Some of these retailers are heavily impacted by imports and some of them aren't. So those who are heavily impacted obviously were concerned about decisions for tenancy. And so I think now that some of that stuff's being resolved, at least it appears to be being resolved, particularly with China and the East, that we could get a little bit more surety and or a little bit more stability in these economic decisions. And I think that's some of the issues that the developer was bringing up that was causing some of the pause.
You said they have some tenants signed. Can we find out who they are?
I can't disclose those at this time, but my goal is it's not for me to tell. That's for them to tell that story. And so what I will do is when we bring this back for DRB approval, I know the mayor has asked that they come in and do a presentation or an update at the council meeting before that.
The council meeting is in June.
In June.
It's kind of interesting. There's a development in Goodyear. It's a brand new one. It's a multi-use. They have about 30% lease, and they identified who those tenants were. There's another one going on in Cave Creek. It's in the planning stages, and the developer there has already announced 2 or 3 tenants. I don't know what the secrecy is about this project, because it's getting a little frustrating. We've been hearing since November that they're this close with a number of tenants, and yet we keep finding out, well, maybe next month or the month after that. If they have tenants signed, why don't they tell us who they are?
And I asked them that question, the mayor's asked them that question, and so we're going to try to get them there in June and answer that question.
So could you tell us where in Cave Creek and what the tenants are? You said they're announced.
What is Cave Creek? Is that Queen Creek?
Oh, Queen Creek.
Like you said Cave Creek.
Oh, sorry, I apologize. There's one in Goodyear. There's a development in Goodyear, and they've already announced that Trader Joe's is coming there. And
Goodyear, Arizona.
They've been working on that for 10 years.
doesn't matter how long.
Yeah, I'm just saying. So I know there's a lot of effort that's been put into the development of that particular, of getting Trader Joe's there and developing that particular property. So these things take time, and we don't own the property. I'm not the developer, so I'll ask these questions. There are certain things that I will share that I can share. There's things that if they say, hey, it's not for you to share, and it's not for me to share, they're going to have to come in. And these are legit questions they're asking. And these are legit questions that I push onto them, and hopefully we can get them to come to the table and answer those questions for
I'll
you.
also point out that both of those developments, there are no subsidies that they're getting from either city.
Yeah.
We have a, what's what I'm looking for? We're contributing substantially to this project.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that entitles us more information than we'll tell you later when we feel like it.
Yeah, these are fair questions.
Steve, do we have consensus on the elevations and the materials and the actual design of the project?
So that's the next step, is going to be through the DRB process. Stacy's been reviewing those plans and the elevations. There's been a lot of conversation regarding that. I think we're coming down to pretty much the elevations in the site plan have been all agreed upon at the staff level. And the next, except that we have, the one issue we have is having to deal with signage height for monument signs. So, but the signage plan can go independent of the site plan and the elevations. So our goal is to try to get the site plan and the elevations on up on the website as soon as possible. So there's plenty of time to review those and get those to the board, so you guys can take a longer look at it. And if we have to deal with the signage issues at a different pace, I think both the developer and the staff are trying to figure out the best way to approach that.
As long as the sign is taller than Bumblebee, I think we'll be fine.
Yeah.
But seriously, there was some discussion that the original elevations and materials, the developer wanted to change them and sort of maybe use less high quality material. Is there any, is that still an issue?
I'll let Stacy address that.
Taken care of?
Yeah, I would say that that's not an issue. I think that was one of the key components working with them from the onset was the initial submittals were not compliant or in alignment with the approved ordinance.
Oh.
Now, from my vantage point is that they're in compliance with that now. They're not, it's not material for material that you saw approved, but those were conceptual plans, but it does have that same similar style and feel that was approved early on. So we have moved through that, and as Steve talks about the signage, I think one option may be if they kind of made their decision on how they'd like to move forward is for the DRB to provide that guidance back to staff on the acceptability of the design and heights of the signage.
Because you had shown us elevations earlier. Are we going to get to see them again?
Absolutely.
Before we vote?
Yes. I mean, that's the whole point of the site plan meeting is to, and this is in particular just for the corner parcel, which is parcel A. But yes, it is for you to review that site plan, and along with site plan is the architectural elevations, landscaping. You'll also see the realignment of the wash and the pathway along the wash. So yeah, you'll be looking to make an approval, to make a determination on it.
Good.
And then, yeah, and I think that's the biggest update everybody wanted on the this morning. And if there's any other updates or questions that you have related to any of the economic development stuff that's going on. Want to move on to the next?
Sure. Code enforcement.
Nope. So facade? Was that, or is code enforcement next?
Code enforcement too.
Oh, okay. So, I'm gonna bring this, get the slides over. And so part of the strategic plan for council, one of the things that economic development was asked to do is start looking at code enforcement, mostly on the commercial side. So I'm not going to be focusing on residential. And this is the kickoff meeting to kind of bring you guys up to speed as the things that we're going to be addressing, the issues that we're facing. We have non-conforming uses that are displacing. We have areas that are being used as storage. We have businesses that say they're coming in as retail, but they're ending up doing wholesale or doing manufacturing. We have challenges with code enforcement as a small town. We don't have a police force. We don't have the same regulatory force that Phoenix or Scottsdale or anybody has. We don't even have a town marshal. We have a code enforcement officer. So it changes things in the way that we have to address things. And it takes a heck of a lot longer for us to be able to walk through these processes because we actually have to go to court on pretty much anything that we want to enforce. Or for the most part, there's a lot of things that to really take aggressive measures are a little bit more difficult for us versus just being able to go out and just write tickets. You know, we're seeing work done without permits. This is always a big issue, and everybody, there's a lot of businesses that come in, and this is the kind of the challenge you have when you have small local business. A lot of them just don't know, and then we don't have landlords that are saying, hey, by the way, if you're signing this lease, make sure whatever you do, you're going to go need permits, or maybe they do and they just ignore it. There's bad contractor advice out there where they say they don't need permits, and so what we're going to be doing is just looking at those issues. But it does create a problem when, you know, the fire inspection gets done a year later and there's all this electrical and plumbing work that's been done and none of it's been permitted, or there's the wrong occupancy, or and then business is not even getting licensed. And it's hard for us because we're still on an analog system, and I know we're going digital. But on an analog system, when you're working off a spreadsheet, you have to reconcile, and even with a digital, you have to reconcile our businesses operating out there with a business license. And so, you know, if you have 300 some businesses spread out throughout town, how do we do that? And we'll kind of go into that. And then signage, storage, and trash. You know, that's some of the things that we're working on. And I say signage, storage, these are the things that are outside the building, people storing stuff outside. There's signage issues. Some of the businesses have kept their temporary signs as permanent signs. We have A-frame signs, we have feather banner signs, and then trash enclosures. I know that's been an issue that a lot of complaints have been made, especially as it relates to some of the restaurants. Our goals are to address both the business issues and property issues. So you can have businesses that are out of compliance and you can have properties that are out of compliance. And so we're going to be looking to, as part of these solutions, to address both of those. And then again, we are a small, local-only type business, and so a lot of these guys are on shoestring budgets. We've got to create reasonable and affordable ways to do this, which does create, it's a challenge to make sure that you're not penalizing somebody with a great idea who's never opened a business before, or maybe doesn't know. So part of that's just going to be through a lot of education and just trying to get as much information as we can get out. We need to ensure the commercial building spaces are used in a manner consistent with the laws, or codes, and this has just been a problem. And you know, again, we don't want to be really hard on this, but I think we should be. We're going to have to be firm, and the idea is that we get ahead of these issues as best as we possibly can, so they don't become issues that you have to deal with in the readers, because that makes it a lot more difficult. And then proper building safety. We have a lot of visitors, we have employees, we have residents that walk into these buildings. They just need to be safe. And so, you know, to say from a fire perspective, I don't know. You look at health code issues. We just need to make sure these spaces are safe, whether these even a tripping hazard. There's a lot of things that we just need to be looking at. Kind of breaking it down to our objectives. Again, making sure that people have proper business licenses. One of the things that we're working on is the process in the town for dealing with both new licenses and with renewals. And how do we create streamlined processes for renewals of people who are doing businesses that are doing things the right way? And how do we catch businesses that are not and make sure that they can get on the right path? And how do we get there in a manner that makes sense for those businesses? And then how are we dealing with new businesses coming in to make sure that we're not going to be creating that problem where, and if they put something down on paper as far as getting their license, making sure that we have enough information there so that they don't do what they're doing, we can quickly hold those businesses accountable for not doing what they say they were going to be doing. So again, one of the aspects we have is that our code requires that any new tenant coming in or anybody opening a business up in town, if they go into a leased space, or even if they're buying the space, so every time a space turns over with a lease, that new tenant has to come in and get a new certificate of occupancy. And that's just the way the code is. And so we've been really trying hard to make sure that along with business licensing, there's a process so that these businesses can also quickly and easily get their certificate of occupancy. And that means that they would either have to pass their fire inspection on an annual basis, on these new businesses, they would have to sign up for an initial inspection where the building safety inspector goes out there, John Gunn right now, and does a courtesy inspection. And if they pass that courtesy inspection as part of their new licensing, then they can get their certificate of occupancy and along with their licensing. When it comes to licensing, one of the things I do want to say is that internally we've been working on a process, all the staff has been working together and identify how that license works through the process. So when it comes in, what we're finding is sometimes the licenses weren't going to planning and zoning to see if they met the zoning requirements and making sure that they go to building safety. And then that way they can make recommendations based on understanding the space and the types of business. Are they going to need permits? Are we asking for the right amount of information for them to say, yeah, I'm adding electrical, I'm adding plumbing, things that would trigger permits. So we're working on that process right now to make sure that we don't issue that business license until everybody checks off and signs off on that particular.
Steve, is there a national uniform commercial code for small towns like ours? I would think there are so many of these kind of codes that there would be some sort of standard, some sort of uniform that we could look at, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, that we don't have to write it ourselves. We can adopt something that's been in use for many years by some standard group that says this is the gold standard, this is what it should be. Do we have anything like that?
So we operate off of the Uniform Building Code, or International Building Code.
Okay, that's it.
And then we also have our zoning code.
Okay.
And so I'll talk about those in just a second.
All right. So we're really talking not so much about designing a program, but enforcing what we have.
Right, but
Is that better?
yeah, so I wanted to kind of outline what the issues are and why we're doing this in the first place and what our objectives are. But we just, and here's another issue that I'll talk about is we only have one commercial zoning. If you go to another community, they could have 2 to 3. And on top of it, they can have overlay districts over those zonings for specific areas. And so right now, we just have a commercial zoning. And so that allows for certain things and it doesn't allow for certain things. And we have some buildings in town, like the stuff at the end of Ed Everett, which looks like warehouses, but we don't have warehouse use. We don't have a heavier commercial use that would allow maybe the particular businesses that are in there, so which is their grandfather, which is why they've been there for 20 plus years, because they've been here since the buildings were built for the most part. And so those are the things we're just going to need to address as we move forward. Specific to business licensing, we're going to look to automate the process. I think that's going to really help out. I already talked about just making sure we have the proper checks and balances as the application comes in. That no license gets issued without a certificate of occupancy. And right now, the fire department, when they do their inspections, asks businesses, do you have your certificate of occupancy? If they say no on a renewal, then we are having a streamlined process to get them caught up so they can get that certificate of occupancy, and it's not going to cost them an arm and a leg to go through that, unless they've done some significant changes to their space or they're not operating it in the way that they originally outlined in that business license. And then, and then I just walk through the fire inspections right there. Any questions on licenses? And then this comes down to the code changes. And so there's 2 codes that we're going to look at. And the one is the International Building Code is adopted. We can make amendments and changes to that. And then we also have the zoning ordinance. And so one of the things that Stacy's going to be doing is doing the zoning update, ordinance update. And as part of that ordinance update, we'll probably be looking at codes and different types of categories to be able to better manage the types of uses and users that we see or where we want those uses and users to go. Obviously, we have to be cautious because if you down zone something, then building owners can say you're taking something away from them. But we'll walk through that. There'll be a lot of engagement as far as working with property owners to make sure we get to a place that's more productive. The other one on here is actually the town code, and that just looks at our process and the penalties and how we can do that to make sure that our code enforcement officer has the ability to go through. So if things slip through cracks or if somebody's not doing what they're doing and we need to get them out, we've got the process in place that we all agree to. This is the process and this is what we're going to stick to. It's interesting is we start this process, property owners start to rebuff it. The nice thing is that the community, members of this community, seem to be very in favor of making sure that we follow through on these things. And so it's, when you do this type of enforcement, it's not easy, and everybody wants you to do it. And then all of a sudden you see somebody's face and they're a small business and they've got a story, and whatever that story is, it starts to turn into more of a gray area conversation about how hard you really want to push on somebody who, when you hear their story, it gets very difficult. And so it's just going to be one of those things where, we're going to have to make sure that we have fast and hard rules, and then make sure that those processes that we put in place are fair and equitable. And then enforcement, generally, I would say the number one way we find out about things is people just complaining. We're a small staff. We don't have anybody that just rides, other than the fire department, that rides around and looks at these businesses on a daily basis. That's, if we see something, we see it. We try to deal with it. But as residents, we're not trying to institute a policy of, tattletale policy. But if we see things that are wrong and we get enough complaints about a specific thing, obviously we're going to go address that thing as best we possibly can. One of the things that takes time in this whole process is because the way we're set up and where our code enforcement works. Let's say that we have a use that's been around notoriously not doing the right thing for several years. We're going to get them out, and everybody said, hey, we got to deal with this. The code enforcement officer basically has to go do a full investigation. They have to put a full investigative report together, which is a pretty good sized binder of information. That information then has to go to the prosecutor over the court, and the prosecutor has to get a date with the judge. And then they have to go through a prosecutorial process to do this. And so those investigations, if the code enforcement officer is going to put their name on it, that has to just be done right. And so unfortunately, we had a change in code enforcement officer, so we were working on some of these. These investigations had been completed with the prosecutor, but our new code enforcement officer can't sign his name to somebody else's investigative work. So some of this just has to be reviewed, and we are walking through these processes again as quickly as we can on some of these ones that have been notorious that people have brought up.
Can I ask, in terms of, you're going to be enforcing the code, the zoning, the municipal code, the zoning, the building code, and whether they're in compliance with permits and licenses, right? What is the most difficult to enforce, i.e. you have to go to court? What is the most expeditious to enforce, i.e. you don't have a business license, ipso facto you're done? In other words, you're chasing various legal standards that they're in violation of. Which one is the easiest to enforce and which is the most difficult to enforce?
I think business licenses typically is the easier one to enforce, especially if it's just a business license. They just haven't, and everything seems to be copacetic.
But if you find that they are not in compliance with the fire code, you can deny them a business license.
Yes.
If they're not in compliance with zoning, you can deny them a business license.
We can.
But it seems to me it's rather than enforce the zoning, you didn't get a special permit for the warehouse. It seems to me it's easier to say you don't have a business license.
Right.
Well, we applied for one. Yeah, but you're in non-conformance. I can't issue you a business license if you're doing a warehouse.
Yeah.
So we're going to enforce it. In other words, I'm trying to keep us out of court, just because court can start, because do you start with a local jurisdiction here, the JP?
Yeah.
And then you have to go to, they have the option to go to Superior Court and all the way up through the process.
So we started with the local court.
Yeah.
Yeah. So your strategy is a good one, because that's exactly what we're working on is ways to tie the business license and business license renewals to non-compliance, right? So we've tied it to a lot of non-compliance, not having a certificate of occupancy. If we've determined that you haven't received a permit on something and that's what the fire department says, then the building safety department can go out there and say, yeah, you need to get a permit for this work that you've done. Or if it comes down to that, this is the trickier one, the fire department's not really well equipped to say whether or not that business is doing what it's supposed to be doing as a part of its business license. That's not their job, right? So as a fire marshal, how do they know if that business is operating as retail, warehouse, and so I think the tougher of all of the issues that we deal with are the zoning issues, the zoning code. Because if somebody changes their business, and I'll give you an example, you had a soap company come in, they were making and selling soap. All of a sudden they stopped selling soap and they're just making soap.
Why are they making soap?
Well, because that's their business, right? So they're
But they're not selling it.
right, but they're selling it, but they're not selling it at retail, right?
Yeah.
So they're just selling it they're a supplier now of soap. But what does that fundamentally do? That fundamentally changes them from a retail use to a manufacturing use. And so now, luckily, that business is now coming back and adding a retail element back in. So the goal is in those situations, try to get them performance, right? But then you have notorious ones like a Free Spirit Gallery that's been sitting there for 4 years and they've been storing stuff in there. And again, you have a building or a property or a tenant that comes in with a story. You try to be understanding, you try to do all those things, but at some point, it just needs to do what it needs to do. And so that's one of the ones where we actually had the full investigation completed, and now we have to redo the investigation, and it's underway to get that completed. But but it's clearly being used as a storage use. She hasn't sold the thing out of that site ever. So those are the things that we're working on.
If an enterprise does not have a business license, do you have to go to the sheriff to shut them down if they say, well, so what? I'm going to keep my operations going.
We can red tag them, but we do not have, we still need to go to court. So even if we have a business license issue, it still has to go to court. And then you have to start working, we don't have the capacity even, the sheriff would have to come in and remove somebody. And the only business I'm aware of that was actually removed in that manner was we had a psychic that was in one of the buildings.
How many cases have gone to court in the last 5 years? Actually gone to court where there was testimony?
I couldn't tell you an exact number, but very few.
Very few.
Yeah,
Under 5, probably?
Yes, and what I was saying, I think as Steve is somewhat describing, is that it's sort of case by case, because sometimes it's like a thread on the sweater. You find out one thing, you start pulling the thread, and it becomes a little bit more complicated. But what I think is powerful about our zoning ordinance, which a lot of these tend to eventually trickle down to being, is that we've defined our zoning ordinance that any violation is a class 1 misdemeanor. So, our goal really is to bring people into compliance. When you start to work with somebody and say, you don't have a business license, if it gets to a certain point, this is going to become a court issue. They tend to want to come into compliance. It's really the sticklers, the Free Spirit Gallery, the ones that have really kind of, I think, dug their feet in the sand, so to speak. But we find that mostly, to get a business license in Carefree is $45. So it's a pretty straightforward process. But I think it's those that are sort of, as Steve sort of described, sort of taking advantage of certain situations, their locations, for example. Steve talked about town code, and this will be something that we'll be talking to in our update, is how do hours of operation tie into people in terms of what their use is, the use is valid and things like that. But I would say once they know that this becomes, this is a significant violation, there's a significant consequence to that, we tend to either it gets worked out or they do move on.
Do you have any idea of sort of the total number of big cases that are in the pipeline now?
So
that you hope to resolve out of court?
I think the bigger issues not the same. The biggest, the meter is one of them. The Free Spirit Gallery is the other, are the two. The other one that we're really concerned about is the museum that's been over at the Galleria. Sorry,
The museum, what's that?
yeah. So there's been so that's what we're getting at, is there's a museum that nobody's ever even known about or heard about, and so there's certain issues that we're dealing with. I would say the process that we were trying to get ahead of these things is working. We actually had a use that was trying to move into where the pet resort was, and it was manufacturing use. They even wrote manufacturing on their license, and they couldn't go in. And it's just, we avoided a situation. The guy was sad, but You know, so, sorry, there's a
But I
man
would
in
say
front of me here, she's driving me crazy.
I think it's true. I think it tends to, in my mind, the biggest issue is, and I don't know how this phenomenon evolved, but it tends to be shops that have ended up not opening to the public and become either manufacturing, but not manufacturing heavy duty, but utilizing their space to make things and not sell them from their space. Or if they were a business that was going to open and they tend to just stockpile their merchandise, and right away we call that a storage use. And as I think Peter alluded to, that requires a special use permit. And I think most of the room here would agree is that I don't think we're looking for a lot of little mini storage facilities in our town center.
And the couple of abandoned buildings behind the gas station, I've heard that the fire department has condemned them, and is there any effort to push that owner to get those things down?
Yeah, so a while back, before we knew who the owner was, we sent out a legal Instagram basically that said you had 30 days to tear them down, well, we're gonna tear them down and put a lien on the property. And then we found the owner, they came walking in, and they said they'll voluntarily do that. Again, we would rather have that situation, so we've been working on that, and then it came down to where the fire department wanted to maybe utilize those buildings to do some training, roof penetrations and all that. They've passed on that, so now we're in a situation where we're trying to work back with the property owner to say, hey, nobody wants to send an Instagram. How do you get to a place where they just agree to knock those buildings down? So they've done a lot of cleanup on the site. They did knock down some of the shade structures that were kind of falling down out there. They cleaned it, they kept the trash off of it, they kept the weeds down. So they've done a nice job of doing that, but you're right. I mean, we need to get to the place where those buildings, they're a nuisance. And I know there's people that go in those buildings. And I was a little nervous last year. There was a huge beehive in there, and I'd hate for somebody to walk in and get attacked by bees. So it's just it's a public safety issue to that. And so those are the things, it's definitely on the radar to try to get that done this summer.
We're gonna nudge that owner to take care of it.
Absolutely. That's all I have for this particular topic.
When do you think this effort will be active? I mean, it sounds like, as I understand it, you guys are all getting together and trying to work out who, where, what, why, when, how, and all of that sort of stuff. When is, I assume Rubin's our enforcement officer?
Yeah, so I think the next steps are going to be that we are putting this process, the internal process, to get ahead of this on the application side. Applications for business licensing. And so we're going to start with the business licensing side of this to try to get as much information as we possibly can, and prevent as much new stuff from coming in as being a problem as we possibly can. That's step number one. And so that'll be an internal process that we're working on, and we're actually working on it right now. We meet weekly on this. And then we talk about specific properties that we need to address. The team does it both on residential and commercial. I fall asleep when they talk about residential, and I wake up with commercial, in totality, we're working on that because this does go beyond, to be honest with you, the commercial side. We do get a lot of residential complaints, and so we'll be dealing with that as well, at least in an internal process, to meet regularly on resolving these issues. Now, they don't get business licenses on the residential side, but they still have to get permits and do all the things that they need to necessarily do. So, and it's a little more difficult when you deal with residential over commercial. Residential has rights that commercial doesn't. So a commercial tenant doesn't have the same rights as a residential. Somebody just squats in a house, they got more rights than a commercial entity does. So, and then the next step on would be to look at the key offenders and just start working on that process to address these key offenders that we're trying to address right now. And then as part of that, working with Ruben, who's just getting up to speed because he's fairly new, on figuring out the best practice that we can have to be able to identify and walk through these processes for notifications, try to get people to comply. Well, how much time do you give them? How do you notice them? So when you say, if you don't comply, here's what the next steps are going to be. and just really put that process in place. And so I want to make sure that we'll get this group involved kind of as we go down the line to kind of review those types of documents and information. We will talk with businesses as well. Again, firm, but it has to be fair. We can't come overbearing, but at the same time, we have to have some defined process that makes sense and everybody agrees to it. And then as leaders, when they come crying to you, you can go, hey, you were treated fairly. You're 1% out of 99% that isn't doing it right. And so, I'm sorry, but the only way I can help you is for you to help yourself. And so that's kind of where we're getting at. We don't have that completely defined yet, because one of the things we need to do is review exactly what that looks like today. But you can't go on a website and definitively see that in one spot. So there's going to be a big communication component to that. So we'll be working with Madison on how we communicate these things via our website, packages of information that go out to new businesses, and so that would be part of what we're doing as well. And then ultimately we'll be making the code changes, and that's going to take a lot longer of time, but that's something that we'll start talking about. The key issues that need to be included in those code changes that need to be made, whether it's the town code, the zoning code.
But that's all down the line. There are obvious violators today.
Right.
When do you think enforcement will start commencing on those obvious violators today?
They're happening right now. But what I need to do is we're figuring out exactly what that whole process is going to look like. And so we're walking through those steps as they happen. But what we need to do is just come back and get a policy from the town, from the council, that basically states this is your policy for enforcement. And we do have one, but we need to make that clear. And so we're working on that, but it needs to be streamlined, so that way everybody knows exactly what we're doing. And that way everybody knows exactly what needs to be done. So you can have a piece of document in your hand and say, by the way, it's been 3 weeks, have you guys red tagged it or whatever it needs to get done? And that's what we need to walk through. And look, Ruben's overwhelmed right now, and he's one guy, and there's a lot. He works at the court. All the staff here, he does a lot more things than just this. And so but he's game to get it done and work on it, and we're working through these processes. And so what we don't want to do is just stop this investigation work to work on process, because we know that there's needs that need to be addressed immediately. And so we are going to go after those key offenders first, and then as we're doing that, we're going to work on this process and then come back to you guys with that.
So the current enforcement is done under the old process?
It's done under the current, yeah.
Okay.
What we have currently. And what we need to do is, and it could be that the current process might work, it just doesn't seem to be clearly defined. I don't think anybody could go on their phone right now and find exactly what those steps are, right? And so that's what we need to do, is just make that a lot clearer, so everybody knows exactly what that's going on. And then when businesses sign up to do business here, they get that, and they know exactly what's going to happen to them if they don't comply.
How many businesses do you have under investigation?
Under investigation right now, I would say heavily one, and
We
then
got
two.
It was, storage container issue on one.
Yep, so we have 2 under investigation right now, and then we're beginning the investigation on the 2 more.
So 4 on the total.
4 total, yep.
And is it the case that Rare Earth is not using the new or the old CVS as storage, but as retail? Is that the case, that they are using it as retail?
So they have signed on to a program where, they said they had a lot of stuff, inventory to bring in, this heavy inventory, and so they would need to be able to stack inventory as a ramp-up period until they started retail operations at that site. And they actually have a temporary CFO. I believe they have till the end of July to comply with having a retail operation there. Otherwise, they won't be in compliance.
Yeah,
It's real easy to determine whether they're doing it, because we could walk in the door and see if they have cash registers.
Right.
Or
we're watching that.
what are used for cash registers now.
Yeah.
Yeah, as Steve mentioned that we, because it looked to us to be, a strong and feasible user for that location. Obviously, there's been intent interest in filling that spot. But we've been watching them because they sort of moved in and then we all kind of came to the table to figure out how, to understand exactly what his business model was. And so, as Steve mentioned, he does have every intention to open up as a retail location. And if he doesn't, then he would be considered a storage use. So,
But he does have to store his stuff there.
yeah, I mean, any business that sells something, stores their merchandise, CVS stores their merchandise, but I guess it's about the predominance of the amount of space in which they store their inventory. So we do have a definition in the ordinance that if you exceed a certain percentage of your store area, then you are considered a storage location. So.
Yeah, we think of them, I think of them more like a furniture store, right?
Yeah.
Their inventory is gonna be on the floor, and they're selling inventory on the floor, more like that. In this particular case, they had asked, because of the type of structure, things they sell, it's fountains and stone structures, they had asked if they could kind of put some stuff out front.
It makes sense.
We said, yeah, that makes sense, and all of a sudden, a stone structure became a transformer.
Yeah,
So,
what was that?
yeah, and so those are the things, and those are issues we're just trying to work through right now. But at the end of the day, they kind of, we call it art, to try to allow this to work is to call it an art walk, and so all of a sudden art becomes part of, what is art, and
Is it open-ended for when he starts actually selling? Is that time thing open-ended?
end of July.
July?
Is he eventually gonna get rid of Bumblebee?
It's for sale.
It is?
Yeah, so it's, you can cop up $80,000, you can have it.
Was that all?
Different type of art that he normally sells.
I think you have a car too that you can trade for it.
Well,
No.
turns into a car.
So, but again, this is one of the things, this is where it comes down to the whole concept of enforcement is as a staff, we're trying to facilitate things that hopefully make sense, as a retail. This could be a great retail opportunity for us to be able to utilize that building. I mean, these things are expensive that he sells.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where you feel like you give an inch and they take a light year, right? In this case, maybe a Buzz Lightyear, or, but it's a tough one because, when we met with them and we walked through what was going to be proposed out there, it's stuff that is natural. And the next thing you know, you're getting something that's unnatural. And it's just, you walk a tightrope on these things. And so we try to be as careful as we possibly can. We try to think through all the various different things, and so in this case, what we did is we set the time frames for him to be able to do the things he needs to do. So
I think it's brilliant that he put Bumblebee there. I've never seen so many people stop, and their kids come out and they walk around, to the extent that encourages people to think about buying his products and buying them in Carefree, and we get the sales tax for that. That's great.
I would say that most people associate that corner with Cave Creek. Anyhow,
I don't care, as long as it's spending money.
as long
I
as
don't
it's
either, I
spending
don't care either.
money. But that is the key, is that we just need to make sure that building doesn't,
We care a little.
it doesn't become a storeroom for sales in Cave Creek, right? And that's what we want to make sure that.
Yeah, but you've already said we have a problem enforcing, right? So if he does do that, how are you gonna get him out?
Yeah,
How
well,
do you force him to switch to retail when you've got others that have been a couple of years storing things?
we got a signed letter that says he's going to do it, so it's going to be a little bit
Okay.
easier. When now the investigation's easy. You just take the letter to court. He said he was going to do it, and he didn't. So
To me, the ultimate solution to that for us would be that he takes over the entire top corner of the Carefree Quarter, and put his entire facility there, and moves out of Cape Creek, and now we get 100% of his income.
I don't think it's big enough for all this stuff.
We'll have to see. He built his building. I think he owns that building.
yeah, let's just get him started here right now.
Let's just-
I'm actually glad they gave
Yeah.
Carefree,
Stacy, you said there was a lot of interest in CVS before he took it. Did I hear you say that?
I don't think I said that, no, it's been pretty quiet for a while. I think Steve had a couple of interested, couple restaurants. if
So
that
there was
makes sense.
interest from people to buy it,
Mhm.
and nobody was interested in leasing it with the lease rates that they were asking for that particular piece of property. We tried to get Trader Joe's in there.
Yeah.
We made a run at them. We even tried to redesign some of the parking on it. We made a run at some other users. Trevor's, we had them look at it. I don't know if you're familiar with Trevor's down in Scottsdale. The liquor store with the restaurant and all that. They came out and looked at it. But again, and then there's some other users that just basically said, we don't want to lease, we want to buy it. And, I think it would have been a great discount tire location too, could have been that. One of the other things we talked to Lowe's potentially on that being a rental center for them. So there's a lot of things that we were looking at as it relates to that. But again, a lot of them just wanted to buy it, and the buyer and the owner was basically stated that, they were just in it too deep to be able to sell it. They would have to sell it at a loss, and they weren't prepared to do that. Sounds to me like Rare Earth is doing some kind of lease purchase thing. So, we'll see. Maybe they're willing to pay the owner's price. I don't know. I didn't get into the weeds on their deal. But just to let you know, those are the things that we look at to try to get into spaces like that.
The important thing is that we have a tenant there who is paying sales tax to us.
Well, we'll get sales tax.
When he starts selling.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, yeah, he will.
Anything else?
So the only thing we have is, I thought you were closing the meeting.
No, we
There's-
have the
there's still
facade
more
improvement
stuff.
program.
So the facade improvement program, we had the legal review, got that back. I think I sent it. And then Les provided some more information, and one of the things that he provided information on was enumerating the first part of the document that outlines all the terms, which I think actually helps out. So that way, if somebody's ever referencing the document, you can go to the enumerated sections. So we have a document that's been looked at by the attorneys. I think we have a pretty strong document. We discussed this in the merchant meeting last week or a week and a half ago. One of the things that they asked that if we can include in the facading program, because they said right now dog urination is one of the biggest issues that they're dealing with. And so if there's ways to include pet stations where private property owners can come in and do kind of similar pet stations to what we did in the gardens, that would be really helpful, because there's so many, they want to encourage dogs, but they want to encourage dogs to be able to go in the right places. And so part of it, just maybe we need more places for them to do that. And it's not in here, but that's one of the things I wanted to see if you guys agree with that as part of adding that to one of the approved items that we can include in the list. I don't have a problem with it. I think makes it a pedestrian environment. We encourage dogs anyhow. And if the businesses are saying that's a problem, I think we should address it.
I agree. So where would we put that in? Do you have a copy of it?
Would that be under exterior improvements?
Yeah, it'd be under exterior improvements. Yeah, allowable exterior improvements.
C14.
Yeah, it'd be 14. They're right there, P and P.
P&Z.
And then what we'll do is I think
Clever, that's a clever thing.
if we're good with this, then the next step really is just to finalize it and get it to council. So if you want, take one more time and give me your thoughts and ideas. I know I got some from Sharon, and so I'll include a couple of those items there, and they were just more, one of them was just about correcting a typo and just.
But also the timing of when they have to have the work done.
Yeah, and that was the other thing. So yeah, one of the things you brought up was the timing. You said within 60 days.
Well, it was the way it was phrased.
Yeah.
It said no less than 60 days.
Right.
And it should have been no
more than 60 days, yeah.
But then the legal review suggested a different time frame, so we've got to reconcile what time frame are we talking about. The legal edits, well, the first thing was in section K on page 4. The second one was on page 7. The legal review and edit said a deadline to complete work. The program work must be completed within agreed schedule to be no longer than 6 months of accepting the terms and conditions. Well,
I'm sorry,
on, this is page 7, item G. That's what the legal edit said. But then on page 4, section K, we said it had to be started within 30 calendar days and completed no less than 60 calendar days. Well, it should be no more than 60 calendar days, but then the legal seems to suggest you've got 6 months. Which way do you want to go?
So
60
60 days was 60 days beyond
The completion.
what we agreed is the completion date. So the
Yeah.
last thing we didn't want to do is to start arguing over whether it's a day or two or this or that.
Mhm.
So was to give people a grace period. So if they're doing what they need to be doing, it was,
Yeah, and I
yeah.
know mine was more, the phrasing, it wasn't no less than, it was no more than.
right. But I think what we can say in K is that you get the extra 60, potentially the extra 60 days, but it can't be any longer than the 6 months, absolute.
Okay, well then, I just think that has to be added.
Yeah, okay, I'll deal with, I'll put that, I'll make sure I
And
make
that
that
could
change.
go in section K on page 4.
Correct. Okay, I'll do that.
Would you state it as a grace period possibly? So it's clear what that was?
Yeah,
Cause I wasn't clear on that myself either.
A grace period of no more than.
Of no more.
yeah, so it should, I mean, that's so, we kind of made it an automatic grace period.
Yeah, see
We can say that as I kind of went back and forth on if they have to ask for it and we grant it, there's no reasonable reason why we wouldn't if they're doing the work. I can add something like that to that effect as well. Like if they're really close, but part of it is, and I was really worried about what if they can't get a certain material,
I agree.
Yeah,
something
and
like that. I don't want to ding them because they did everything else, right? And nothing to do with their fault.
But Sharon's right, the wording is incorrect.
But also the idea, which is it? If you're saying there's a grace period, I'm fine with that. But
Yeah.
is it 60 days or is it 6 months? That's all I'm saying. Gotta be clear to people, which do you mean?
Yeah, so let's say that they said they had a completion date of 3 months.
Mhm.
And then they got the extra 60 days, right? They're still within 6 months. What I will say in K is that time, that grace period, can't extend more than the 6 months if we want to go that route.
There you go, there you
Okay.
go.
Yep.
Spell it out directly like
Yep.
that.
So, one question, on the same related topic, I believe they have to start within 30 days of getting a green light,
Right.
but they also need to get permits before they can begin construction. So I can imagine a scenario where it takes more than 30 days to get an approved building.
Okay, yeah.
So that should be addressed.
So we say it's 30, yeah. So let me think about what.
Why don't we give them the same kind of grace period for start?
Permits.
Yeah, so, but within. I'll make it clear that start the project means submitting for permits and doing all of those things and,
So not just approval of the application, but also permits in hand?
right. So I can do with that and say they have this,
That's when they do.
And then the construction phase clock cannot commence until after they get a permit.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
but in no sense are we doing projects that are gonna take more than a year. I mean, otherwise, those are huge projects, right? So, I'll address that.
How about maybe they have to submit within 30 days for their permits? That way you don't tie it to how long it takes to get the permit.
Right, yeah, so yeah, they'll have to submit within 30 days to get the permits, they'll have 6 months to get the project done. Or whatever we agree to, if we agree to a shorter term, but it's still in that 6 month period, they can get an automatic, they can get up to 60 days of, yeah. Okay,
Then unforeseen things that happen, they can always come back and talk to us.
right,
We want this to happen, so we're gonna work with them.
right, yeah, and we won't unreasonably withhold, yeah, I'll do something
Take
about
your
it.
money back.
Okay,
Well, maybe to eliminate any misunderstanding or misreading, could you at the end of this put just a timeline in?
yeah, so they have to put a timeline in.
No, you, for the process. In other words, day 1 through day 30 for the application, so many days to get your permit, so many days to get the project done, etc. Since there seems to be confusion when you read this.
Yeah, I'll do that.
So a visual is what you're saying at the end, that'd be nice.
I'll do an
Little
exhibit.
visual.
Yeah, or even within this K, I'll do sub letters underneath that just outline that.
Yeah.
Okay. That works.
That's good.
Otherwise, looks
Good, thanks, yeah, I'm excited about it. I think the businesses were excited, and so then we just gotta start talking to property owners. I don't know how much uptake we'll get like in the first quarter, because it's gonna be a quarterly program. But, you know, hopefully by the second quarter, more businesses, more property owners will be, you know, because they have to take time to identify the project they wanna do anyhow.
How are you notifying them of this?
So they'll work with Madison, and we'll do an outreach program for all the property owners in the town center area.
What's in the tentative budget for this?
50,000. And then I do have more money budgeted for another topic, or for the positioning. And if I have money left over for that, I can probably roll that into this particular program as well.
and we were gonna evaluate this after the first year, right?
Yeah, exactly, absolutely.
That'd be
Yeah.
better, yeah.
Yeah, actually, what I want to do is you know, we'll as soon as we get projects in, we'll talk about those.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'll do updates.
Yeah.
Of where things sit and how it's working.
Because I think the initial intent was we'd run this for a year, and then we would revisit it.
Yep. But we'll continuously evaluate it through that 3-year process.
Any other business?
Let's
Entertain a motion to
So moved.
Yeah, second.
second, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? I appear to have it, do have it.